Poor student married a 69-year-old millionaire woman. A week later, he was shocked by what he saw. 7 days after a poor law student, Ethan Walker married a wealthy 69-year-old woman, a gray sky loomed over the small Texas college town. Rain slicked the streets as Ethan trudged along the sidewalk, his backpack heavy on his shoulder, worry etched on his 23-year-old face. Juggling his final year of law school, a part-time job, and his late father's crushing debts, the world felt increasingly claustrophobic. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. "Ethan Walker speaking," he answered. A composed, authoritative voice responded, "Mr. Walker, this is Victoria Hughes. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Ethan frowned. "I'm sorry, who are you? How do you know about?" "I know enough," she smoothly interrupted. "Let's meet at Hughes Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Ethan could protest. Confused but intrigued, he headed to the bistro. The rain intensified as he arrived, his jacket offering little protection. Stepping inside, he was greeted by warm lighting and the rich aroma of fresh coffee. At a corner table sat Victoria Hughes, a striking woman with impeccably styled silver hair, dressed in a tailored suit that exuded wealth. "Ethan," she greeted, gesturing for him to sit. Her tone was calm yet commanding. Ethan hesitated before taking the seat opposite her. "Mrs. Hughes, what's this about?" "Straight to the point, good," she said, sipping her tea. "Ethan, I know about your debts, the ones your father left behind. I know you're barely scraping by. I'm here to offer a solution." Ethan's brows furrowed. "And what would that be?" She set down her cup, her piercing blue eyes meeting his. "Marry me." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Ethan blinked, sure he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, and in return, you'll be my husband." Ethan let out a disbelieving laugh. "You're serious? Why me? You don't even know me." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Ethan. I need a companion, someone to share my name, my estate, and nothing more. Think of it as a contract." Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. "This is insane. What's in it for you?" Her expression softened for the first time. "I've spent my life alone, Ethan. I have no children, no family left. I want companionship, even if it's just for appearances. And I want control of my legacy, a husband will help solidify that." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "I can't. I need time to think." "Of course," she replied coolly, "but don't take too long. The offer doesn't stand forever." Ethan walked home in the soaking rain, the water seeping through his clothes. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, her pale face etched with worry. The cost of her treatments and his younger sister's looming tuition had drained them both. "Ethan," his mother said softly, after he explained Victoria's proposition, "I know it sounds unthinkable, but if she's willing to help, maybe it's worth considering." Ethan stared at his hands, torn between his pride and his desperation. "You're asking me to marry a woman I don't love just to solve our problems. I'm asking you to save yourself," she said, her voice trembling, "to save us." The following morning, Ethan returned to the bistro. Victoria was already there, her demeanor as calm and composed as before. "You've decided?" she asked, not looking up from her tablet. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'll do it." She smiled faintly, setting down her tablet. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." A week later, Ethan stood in a small courthouse, dressed in a suit Victoria had provided. The ceremony was quiet, witnessed only by Victoria's lawyer and a notary. As they exchanged vows, Ethan couldn't shake the unease in his chest. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Victoria turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Walker." As they left the courthouse, rain drizzling once more, Ethan looked at his reflection in a puddle and wondered, have I just saved my family, or sold my soul? The gates to Victoria Hughes's estate creaked open as Ethan's cab rolled up the long driveway. The house loomed ahead, a sprawling mansion that could easily pass for a museum. Its towering columns and pristine stone facade exuded old money, but its windows seemed dark and lifeless. Ethan stepped out, suitcase in hand, feeling like a visitor in someone else's dream, or perhaps nightmare. Victoria greeted him in the foyer, her demeanor as polished as ever. "Welcome, Mr. Walker," she said, the formal address sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. "I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. Dinner is at 7. He nodded mutely, following a housekeeper who led him to his room. It was opulent, with a king-sized bed, antique furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. Despite its luxury, the room felt cold, untouched by human warmth. That evening, Ethan sat stiffly at the long dining table. Victoria was at the other end, impeccably dressed in a silk blouse and pearls. The food was extravagant, prepared by a chef he hadn't seen, served by staff who moved silently. "I trust you're settling in," Victoria said, cutting into her filet mignon with surgical precision. "It's different," Ethan replied cautiously. "This place is huge. Feels like I'll get lost." Victoria smirked. "You'll get used to it. Or you won't. Either way, you're here." Ethan bristled at her bluntness. "You didn't mention much about your late husband before." Victoria's knife paused mid-cut. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin before speaking. "He was a businessman, like your father. Their paths crossed once or twice." Her tone darkened. "But, as you might imagine, not all encounters end well." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes sharp. "Let's just say unfinished business has a way of lingering." She picked up her glass of wine. "But that's in the past. You'll soon understand why I chose you." Her cryptic words left Ethan deeply uneasy. After dinner, he wandered the halls of the estate. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of floorboards underfoot. He passed several locked doors, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light. Each one seemed to whisper secrets he wasn't meant to know. As the days passed, Ethan grew more unsettled. The staff avoided eye contact, speaking in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening. He overheard snippets of conversations that made his stomach twist. Why him? Does she even know? She never does anything without a reason. He'll figure it out eventually, they always do.
One evening, while pacing the library, Ethan noticed Victoria's desk. Papers were strewn across its surface, along with a small, ornate key. It gleamed under the desk lamp, its intricate design catching his eye. His gaze darted around the room, no one was there. Heart pounding, he reached for it. The key was heavier than he expected, cool to the touch. Ethan's mind raced. Could this be for one of the locked doors? He glanced toward the hallway where shadows danced against the walls. His breath quickened as he slipped the key into his pocket. That night, lying in his luxurious but suffocating room, Ethan turned the key over in his hands. A million questions swirled in his mind, but one loomed above all: what was Victoria hiding, and why had she really chosen him? The mansion was shrouded in stillness when Ethan crept down the hall. The key felt like a lead weight in his pocket, its cool surface pressing against his thigh. His pulse quickened as he approached the door he'd noticed earlier, its ornate handle gleaming faintly in the moonlight streaming through the windows. Glancing over his shoulder, Ethan turned the key in the lock. The soft click reverberated in the silence, sending a chill down his spine. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was a time capsule, frozen in another era. Dusty furniture and faded wallpaper surrounded him. Photographs in tarnished silver frames lined a table, their images capturing happier times, Victoria as a young woman, a man who must have been her late husband, and another couple Ethan didn't recognize. But it was the stack of papers on the desk that caught his attention. Ethan flipped through them, his eyes widening. Legal documents detailed failed business deals between Victoria's husband and Ethan's father. A particular letter, written in sharp, slanted handwriting, accused Ethan's father of fraud. "You ruined everything. My family was left with nothing because of your lies." His breath hitched when he noticed the last page, a marriage license. His name and Victoria stared back at him, stark against the paper. It was dated weeks before their wedding, far earlier than he'd known. On the desk lay an old, leather-bound diary. Ethan hesitated, then opened it. The entries were Victoria's, revealing a calculated plan to trap Ethan in a marriage that would fulfill her ultimate goal, to settle old scores. "I will take everything from him, just as his father did to me. He will be my pawn." Ethan froze as the door creaked behind him. "Enjoying yourself?" Victoria's voice was icy, cutting through the shadows like a blade. He spun around, guilt and fear writ large on his face. "Victoria. You thought you'd find answers here." She stepped into the room, her silhouette sharp against the dim light from the hall. "Curiosity killed the cat, Ethan. What do you think you're doing?" Her voice was low but firm. "Why did you really marry me? Is this about my father? Is this some kind of revenge?" Victoria's eyes hardened, her usual composed facade cracking. "It's not your place to ask questions, Ethan. Just do what you're told, and you'll leave this marriage better off than you started. Isn't that enough for you?" Ethan's fists clenched. "Enough? You've lied to me, manipulated me. This isn't a marriage, it's a trap." Victoria's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile. "A trap, is it? Maybe you should have thought twice before signing those papers." She stepped closer, her tone venomous. "You may think you're smart, Ethan, but you're just like your father, blind to the damage you cause until it's too late." Ethan glared at her, the weight of his father's legacy crushing him anew. "If you hated him so much, why take it out on me? I had nothing to do with what he did to your family." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. Finally, she turned on her heel. "You're in over your head, Ethan. Stay out of matters that don't concern you." With that, she left the room, her footsteps fading down the hall. Later that night, Ethan lay wide awake in bed, his mind racing. Victoria's words haunted him, but so did the documents and diary. Why had she gone to such lengths to entangle him in her schemes? Was it really just about revenge? His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of Victoria's voice. He slipped out of bed and crept toward her study, pressing his ear against the door. "Make sure the transfer is complete," Victoria said, her tone sharp and commanding. "We can't let him back out now. Time is running out." Ethan's blood ran cold. Whatever was happening, he was in deeper than he'd ever imagined. Ethan sat alone in the grand library, his mind a whirlpool of fear and confusion. Victoria's cryptic words and the damning contents of the locked room made it clear he was in over his head. The once imposing estate now felt like a gilded prison, its luxurious trappings concealing dark secrets. That evening, Ethan approached Mr. Bennet, the estate's head butler, a man whose calm demeanor suggested he'd seen and heard more than he let on. "Ethan," Mr. Bennet said, his voice a low rumble, "I need your help. Something isn't right here." The older man regarded him with a steady gaze, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Bennet, I was wondering how long it would take before you came to me." "Ethan, you know something, don't you? About Victoria, about all of this." Mr. Bennet hesitated before speaking. "You're not the first young man to be drawn into Victoria's world, Ethan. She's clever, resourceful, and ruthless when it comes to her goals. My advice? Watch your back. Ethan's chest tightened. Why are you still here if you know what she's capable of? Mr. Bennett's expression softened, a flicker of regret passing across his face. Some of us don't have the luxury of walking away. Determined to find a way out, Ethan began devising a plan. He reached out to a trusted friend from law school, Nathan. Under the guise of catching up, Ethan said, "Nathan, hypothetically, if someone signed a contract under coercion or false pretenses, is there any way to avoid it?" "Hypothetically, yes," Nathan replied, "but it depends on the evidence." "Why? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Ethan deflected. "Just a class project I'm working on." "Thanks, man." The next few days, Ethan carefully searched Victoria's office whenever she was away, hoping to uncover something that could explain her obsession with his father. Late one night, as he rifled through her desk, he found an envelope addressed to his father. The letter was a scathing condemnation written by Victoria herself. It accused Ethan's father of embezzlement, fraud, and deceit that had led to the financial ruin of Victoria's family and, ultimately, the death of her husband. "You left us with nothing. My husband's heart couldn't take the stress, and he's gone because of you. I will see to it that your family pays for what you've done." Ethan's stomach churned. Victoria's actions weren't just about reclaiming her fortune, they were about revenge, fueled by years of pain and anger. Returning the letter to its hiding place, Ethan resolved to act. He couldn't allow Victoria to use him as a tool for her vendetta. That night, he began mapping out possible escape routes from the estate. But Victoria's sharp instincts caught wind of his unease. The next morning, she found him in the breakfast room, her icy presence cutting through the quiet. "Victoria, you've been busy, haven't you?" Ethan froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victoria smiled coldly. "Don't play coy with me, Ethan. If you think you can outsmart me, you're sorely mistaken. I've dealt with far craftier opponents than you." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I'm not doing anything wrong." Victoria leaned closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "If you betray me, you'll wish you hadn't. Remember that." She straightened and left the room, leaving Ethan to grapple with the growing realization that escape might be more dangerous than staying. But staying meant surrendering his life to Victoria's twisted plans, a fate he refused to accept. The air in the estate felt charged as Ethan paced the library, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his shoulders. The private investigator he'd quietly hired had just left, confirming the devastating truth: Victoria's late husband, Robert Hughes, had been swindled by Ethan's father in a fraudulent real estate deal that stripped the Hughes family of their fortune. Robert's death from a heart attack soon after was the final blow, leaving Victoria embittered and determined to exact revenge. Victoria's proposal to marry Ethan had been more than a calculated plan to settle scores, it was a way to make his family suffer, even from beyond the grave. Ethan clenched his fists, anger coursing through him. How could she blame him for his father's sins? But as much as he resented Victoria's actions, he couldn't deny the pain that had driven her. That evening, Ethan met his law school friend, Nathan, in secret. With Nathan's help, he compiled the evidence he had collected from Victoria's office and the investigators' findings. Among the documents, they discovered Victoria's involvement in current business dealings that bordered on illegal, shady partnerships and falsified reports designed to rebuild her empire at any cost. "Nathan," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency, "this is enough to take her down, but you need to be careful. If she realizes you're on to her, there's no telling what she might do." Ethan nodded grimly. "She's already done enough damage. It's time to end this." The next morning, Ethan waited in the grand sitting room, the evidence tucked securely in his bag. When Victoria finally entered, her icy composure intact, he stood to face her. "Ethan, we need to talk," Victoria said, raising an eyebrow, her tone clipped. Is that so? What could be so urgent? Ethan's voice was firm as he pulled out the documents. I know everything. About my father, about Robert, about what you've been doing to rebuild your fortune. For the first time, Victoria's calm exterior faltered. Her eyes flicked to the papers in Ethan's hand. Victoria, you've been snooping again, haven't you? Do you even understand what your father did to my family? Ethan stepped closer, his voice rising. I understand what you've endured, but what about the people you've hurt along the way? What about me? I didn't do anything to deserve this. Victoria's jaw tightened. My family deserved to lose everything. My husband deserved to die of stress and heartbreak while your father lived comfortably. Don't talk to me about fairness, Ethan. Ethan's hands shook as he held up the evidence. Revenge won't bring him back, Victoria, and it won't undo what happened. You've spent your life consumed by this, hurting innocent people, ruining lives. When does it end? Victoria's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan thought he saw something close to regret in her eyes. You remind me of him, you know, Victoria said softly. Robert. That same fire, that same stubbornness. I didn't expect to feel anything for you, Ethan. But here we are. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by her admission. If you feel that way, then stop this. Let it go before it's too late. But before Victoria could respond, the sound of car tires crunching on gravel echoed through the estate. Moments later, uniformed police officers entered the room, followed by Nathan. Officer, Ethan said, his voice steady, Victoria Hughes, we have a warrant for your arrest. You're being charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Victoria's face hardened as she looked from the officers to Ethan. Victoria, Ethan met her gaze, his voice steady, you left me no choice. As the officers led Victoria away, she turned back to Ethan one last time. You may think you've won, Ethan, Victoria said, her voice low and strained, but revenge isn't so easily undone. Be careful it doesn't consume you, too. Ethan watched her go, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. He had exposed the truth and protected himself, but the weight of Victoria's parting words lingered. Was she right? Would the shadow of their shared past ever truly fade? The gavel's sharp bang echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of Victoria Hughes's trial. Ethan sat silently in the back row, watching as the once commanding woman he had married faced the consequences of her actions. Despite everything, his testimony had helped reduce her sentence. He hadn't done it out of sympathy, but out of a deep understanding of the complexities of their shared story. Victoria turned briefly in her seat, her gaze meeting Ethan's for the first time. There was no trace of the cold calculation that had defined her before. Instead, she offered a faint, almost apologetic nod. Days later, Ethan was summoned to the estate one final time. The grand house, once intimidating and isolating, now felt empty. Victoria had arranged for him to receive the property's deed. The estate lawyer handed Ethan a letter in Victoria's elegant handwriting. It was never about the money, Ethan. It was about closure. Robert deserved justice, but I lost sight of what truly mattered. You've shown me something I thought I'd forgotten, the capacity to move forward. This estate is no longer a monument to my pain, it can be something more. Use it well. Ethan sold the estate, a decision that came easily. Its grandeur had been a gilded cage for both him and Victoria. The proceeds allowed him to pay off his family's debts, finally freeing his mother from the shadow of his father's mistakes. With the remainder of the funds, Ethan established a scholarship fund in Robert Hughes's name. It was a way to honor the man who had unknowingly become a casualty in the feud between two families. Ethan's return to law school felt like a homecoming. This time, he was more determined than ever to use his education for good. He interned at a legal aid center, helping individuals who, like Victoria, had been wronged and left without recourse. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived for Ethan. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. He sat on a park bench near campus and unfolded the paper.